Hello and welcome to today's episode of the podcast. I'm Adam Morris, but today my co-host Daniel Welling is leading the episode. And he is catching up with Graham Stead, a seasoned MSP leader who has seen it all, starting as a techie at HP, founding his own business, Solsis, and later playing a key role in scaling NewCMI. Graham brings a wealth of experience in both technical operations and business growth, making him the perfect guest to discuss the intricacies of MSP sales and how to scale. So today expect to learn the evolution of managed service providers and the key transitions that drive growth, how to structure your sales team to separate new business acquisition from account management, and valuable insights on sales strategies, pipeline management and marketing efforts that actually make an impact. So stay tuned as we deep dive into Graham's journey and his strategies for scaling an MSP business.
Graham, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And I feel this is a little overdue as well. I think we met 3 or 4 months ago and talked about this recording. So great to have aligned the diaries. And generally, it's been really interesting catching up with you after a number of years since we were, well, I guess colleagues and co-shareholders in NewCMI. And what a fascinating journey you've had from the Solsis days to NewCMI and to present time. So the topic today will be, and we're very pleased having thought this up in the green room a few minutes ago, sales that scale. And we didn't need that. This was actual intelligence, not artificial. And what we're going to do is look back over both of our careers, having gone from owner-led sales to, in your case, leading the sales function for tens of millions of pounds, MSP business, and the distinct phases and transitions that might occur. So perhaps we could kick off with, tell us a little bit about the Solsis days. Like, where did the first customer come from? How did you win them?
Yeah, and it's crazy just sort of before I get into that, just thinking that, the time we were together at CMI is coming up for 10 years next year. I sold Solsis to CMI in 2016, so that's just crazy time, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, Solsis, I think probably like maybe many MSPs, I was a techie. I came out of school and was working for HP as a techie, fixing printers and HP net servers as they were. And, I won't go into the depth of the story, but, long story short, opportunities sort of arose and I sort of left HP on the Friday, went back on the Monday doing exactly as I was doing, but effectively as a contractor to them under the guise of Solsis. So that's where, so my first customer was actually HP, to answer your question. Right. So that's really where the business started, and, started that with a business partner, a guy that I sort of met through the sort of the training scheme that I'd been on at HP. And we did what we were doing and eventually sort of evolved into an MSP. I mean, we started that business back in 96. So, that was, MSPs weren't really around in the guys we see them at. There was all break fix if it even existed then, really. It's probably more sort of third-party maintenance type stuff. So that's what we did, and sort of evolved, and probably back in sort of 2006, 2007 was when we really started to sort of move into, focusing on SMBs and providing outsourced support rather than what was much more a project management, logistical management business into some larger enterprise businesses. Took on Kaseya and ConnectWise, I think we started with in 2008, maybe, sort of an early-ish UK adopter of those sort of tools, and sort of grew from there, really. So, yeah, the first businesses that from an MSP perspective that we work with, we had to sort of fight for, but I was going to say it was really easy then. I mean, I wouldn't say it's really easy, but a lot easier than it was now. If you think back to the time, that people were doing break fix and they didn't have like the Kaseya RMM tools and the agents on the devices. So it was really quite a differentiator to be able to go into, an SMB business and talk to that owner and say, we'll monitor, we'll clean out the old files off your machine, we'll keep them sort of tuned, we'll put an AV agent on there and we'll monitor that, we'll make sure they're updated, and we'll keep an eye on your Exchange server to make sure the logs don't fill up and your Exchange server doesn't go down, all that sort of stuff, which, when you're competing with a break fix business, which really was just a very remote waiting for the phone call to ring, it was really quite compelling. So actually, just being able to sort of talk to SMB businesses with that as the differentiator, because it really was a differentiator then, we started sort of hoovering up, accounts really at that time, which probably is where we always talk about, what is the differentiator? And obviously for MSPs these days, that's just incredibly hard. But if you can find something, and that's something I'm really quite sort of passionate about, trying to help the MSPs I work with, trying to find what that is, it can really make a difference.
And so I understand having a competitive offer once you're in front of a prospect, but how are you actually getting in front of people?
Back in the early Solsis days. Oh my God, this is like this many years ago now, hasn't it? Stretching my memory back. It would have been, just the very typical, networking, whether it was, IOD at the time. I remember being a member of IOD. I tried the B&I stuff for a while, which certainly for me back then in the area I was in wasn't that successful for me, but I know a lot of MSPs use that to sort of reason that days. So yeah, it was a case of getting out there, getting out and about, meeting people, making phone calls. We tried a few agencies, some sort of telemarketing agencies, had some success, but I think my experience with sort of the one particular agency we really did work with was very good success for sort of 6 to 9 months, and then it dropped off. Now, whether that dropped off for reasons of our own doing, or whether it dropped off because the telemarketing agency have got their newer clients and they're focusing on those, who knows. But yeah, it was just sort of very, what we still consider very traditional ways of actually getting in front and finding prospects to have a conversation with. And it was just the fact that, when you had that conversation, you had such a compelling, different offering. And also bearing in mind that back then, many of the SMBs you were talking to didn't have a sort of outsourced IT partner. You're thinking about then technology, and this is scary, when we first started Solsis, email wasn't a thing, maybe it was just about becoming a thing, and I remember, our service desk, you'd have, Exchange server go down or for whatever reason, and the MD of the business would ring you back, and say, look, when's it going to be back up? As long as it's back up by the end of tomorrow, that's fine. I mean, you can imagine that now. It's just a different environment to work in.
I think you had different customers to me even back then, because no one would say, next week, no problem at all. I'm due an email on Wednesday week, so as long as it's ready for then.
Still a relatively short time.
Yeah, only a quarter of a century, give or take, and that's why we both have pretty similar haircuts. But okay, so let's pick up on that point that you made there, that there was an opportunity because people didn't have a technology partner, a TSP, an MSP, whatever you want to identify as. But some might say that actually that was a harder environment. And actually, if you do have an incumbent MSP and they're not doing a very good job, or you can differentiate against them, or there's a poor service level, there's already a level of budget spent. Whereas if they don't have an MSP, actually, you're selling a concept and you're having to carve out a budget. So it's perhaps a different type of sale then.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you're right. As far as if it was the first sort of outsourced experience that the business was using, then yes, there is a sort of there's additional, but typically, the conversation then would have been around, either how they're doing at the moment and the fact that the MD of the accountancy practice or someone was having to try and, keep, and, that's not just a case of turn it off and turn it back on anymore. There's more complexity to that. And I guess then from the other side of things, if you were competing with somebody that was already working with an outsourced support provider, they were typically in a break fix mode, at that time. Right. Yeah. So again, it was very easy to have that conversation. And it's funny, we hear it a lot now about, being sort of business outcome based. But it was very much that conversation of, back then, very much like lawyers and accountants to say, the minute somebody rang, and if you took 20 minutes on the phone with the service desk, that was 20 minutes and you just sort of clocked it up. And it was all block hours or time bank agreements and that sort of things. So of course, from the business perspective, it was very difficult for them to budget. They were spending, but they didn't know whether they're going to spend £200 or £2,000. Yeah. So actually as an MSP, be able to go to them with this tool set and additional sort of service and value you could provide with that tool set that was coming into the market, but actually go to them with a compelling offering that says, okay, well, we know from our experience that a business like you will typically need this amount of service. So we'll charge you for that amount of service. And it's now in our interest as well to make sure we keep the lights on, keep it running smoothly so your users don't call us. So the dynamic of the relationship changed. So, that was very easy if you're competing against an incumbent who was still in a break fix model. If you wound forward, let's just say 5 years from there, where lots more people had made the move to sort of the MSP model from break fix, much more sort of end user companies were using some form of outsource and therefore typically using somebody in a MSP model with the MSP tool set. You were starting to compete with people that were doing exactly the same as you, saying the same things as you, and you're starting to look very similar. So that really did start to get a lot harder.
And then, of course, we get to maybe the real reason that people actually change, which is they've got pain and it's at a sufficient level that they have their incumbent, the incumbent isn't delivering, and now they're sufficiently motivated to at least entertain a move, if not actually then follow through and make that move. So perhaps some change in times there, but some consistent themes as well across the decades that you never thought you were going to be talking about your career in decades.
No, it's scary. Yeah. Right.
We'll come back to the podcast in a minute, but first, I just want to introduce you to the mentoring service from MSP Finance team. How long will you carry on struggling on your own, juggling cash flow, feeling like you're barely making ends meet, when the very reason you started your MSP was not just to help others master technology, but also to secure your own financial future? Or perhaps you've grown your MSP to a good size and are looking to prepare for an optimal sale or acquisition, but have never done it before. We've walked in your shoes. We're ex-MSP owners and have built our businesses from startup to exit, and know exactly how it feels to be constantly firefighting or struggling to grow profit. And that's why our mentoring, or call it coaching if you prefer, exists to help you achieve the rewards you set out to achieve in the first place. More profit, more time, and the freedom to focus on what truly matters. So you're probably asking, why should we work with you? Well, we deliver results. Here are just 2 examples. A 10 million MSP with a 7-strong leadership team, but lackluster results. Within just 2 quarters of working with us, their profits began to climb. At the end of year 1, their profits will have jumped from 300K to 1.3 million. But we're not that big, I hear you say. Well, we work with smaller MSPs as well. A 400K MSP was suffering a 10% loss before we engaged with them, and were struggling to move forward for years. Again, within a 12-month period, we've turned that business around. They've got new clients, they've got their mojo back, and they made a 10% profit this year. If you'd like results like this, book a free consultation now at mspfinanceteam.com, and we'll discuss a burning issue that's been holding you back and give you several key actions to take away and implement completely free of charge with no further obligations. Don't settle for less. Make your MSP everything you dreamed it to be.
And just before we get on to perhaps what I'm really keen to understand is what happened post Solsis. So when we get to NewCMI, and then as NewCMI, then scaled with further acquisitions. But one of the things that really interested me that I wanted to ask you about was, and I don't think your journey is dissimilar to many other MSPs that have evolved into the sort of sales role, but you started as an engineer. So at what point did you accept that I'm now a business owner and therefore I'm actually a salesperson now? And how was that transition for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. It's over the last 6 months or so since I've sort of been out of an MSP and sort of doing my own thing, been sort of thinking about it a little bit. And there isn't really I don't remember one event, one sales opportunity, one customer in particular that did that. I guess it's one of those things where you're a techie that starts a business, and for us, we had HP and a couple of other accounts that came as a result of sort of working through HP. So you sort of you have to deal with the commercial sort of customer relationship piece. Yeah, so whilst you're still maybe doing the techie piece, whatever that may be, you still got to do the commercial relationship piece. So you sort of, I think you naturally evolve into that sort of role. And then, the next step then is actually into the sort of the prospecting and the sort of trying to actually create demand, and then actually really thinking about yourself as a salesperson and sort of talking pipeline and opportunities moving through to that stage. So, I think, I was lucky in as far as Solsis, there were two of us that ran the business. So, we both did selling, and we both sort of, did sort of different, I guess, focus on different parts of the business. We sort of bounced off each other. So it wasn't, being an MSP by yourself, I imagine, is a really lonely place. And it was really lonely when there was two of us, when we could go to the pub at the end of the day and moan about or celebrate, whatever it may be. So, that was good in the fact we had each other to support and encourage ourselves. But no, I think it is that point when you you transition into pipeline management and do the real sales stuff. But I don't think even in the sort of the last 4 or 5 years of Solsis, yes, we were reasonably structured in the fact we had board meetings. We had a sort of an outsourced accountancy firm that sort of almost sort of came and sort of did our board meetings quarterly and sort of gave us some structure there. So there's a bit of formality around having to, just to report on opportunities and pipeline. But if I still had access to those, I'd probably be a little bit surprised at how, I'm going to use the word numpty, they were relative to what we do now. So it was really only, when we eventually sold to CMI, my role then became very much around the sort of the sales and marketing. But post the integration piece, once we sort of settled through the integration, the role was very much, it was sales and marketing. They didn't have a sales director. The MD of the business effectively was the sales director. So, part of the acquisition and or him scaling the business was the fact he could put different people into different positions. So I had that. So I was able then to sort of stop having all the multiple hats, all those MSP, we've all been there. It might be the HR hat one day, it's a finance hat because you want about cash flow or making payroll, or it's a customer service hat because somebody's dropped a ball and a customer's not happy, or it might be the sales hat, all the different hats. Whereas, suddenly, moving from, owning an MSP sort of wholly into being in a sort of invested sort of shareholder in a larger MSP where I could focus on a role, which for me was sales and marketing. So, those last 7, 8, 9 years of CMI, that was my role. So then you can really focus in on the expertise and make sure you got all the measures and, the coaching and all that stuff that's needed.
And at that point, then you refer to yourself as a salesperson by trade rather than a techie, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to be honest, if you ask me that question, if we round back, 5 years, 7 years from the end of sort of Solsis as it was, I would probably said then I was a salesperson, but I just, I was also the HR person. I was also the ops person. I was also, but there was more sales awareness, but I wouldn't say I had the craft of selling.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, makes sense.
One final question before we get on to the NewCMI sales journey. And that actually relates, just going back to the start of the Solsis with HP, this is a pretty big customer. It's not an SMB business. Yeah. And the difference between selling to larger customers versus smaller ones, and perhaps more professional qualified buyers versus unqualified, unprofessional buyers. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think HP is probably a different one to compare it to, because, I always say we were lucky. I mean, you have to make your own luck at the end of the day, don't you, with these things? But, the way in which we found ourselves starting Solsis was sort of I touched on earlier, and then my business partner that joined us had moved into a different part of HP, so into sort of the project management sort of part of the business. So, we had relationships. We were known quantities to some extent. And if you imagine back then, and this is before, the HP Compaq and, merger, acquisition, whatever you want to call it, and then all the subsequent splits of that, it was a business where they were doing lots and lots of, every time Microsoft brought out a new operating system with a server or desktop, you had to change your hardware, as you remember back in those days. So, that's what it's about. So we were very much in a subcontractor relationship. So we weren't really having to sell. I think the one thing we did do really well was we made ourselves invaluable to some extent. So in their pre-sales process, you have to imagine these are pretty long sort of sales cycles for some of the sort of the larger corporate stuff they were doing. We just made ourselves, available, invaluable, etc., and just sort of really helpful, because for us, if they won the deal, we'd get the slice of it, which was the bit that we did. And they could be sort of 500, 600, 700K services projects. We didn't sell hardware at this point in time. It was just purely services business. So it was worth the investment in doing that. And that probably then sort of hooks in some way neatly into why we start to focus on SMBs, because sort of 9/11 happened and the sort of dot-com crash and everything. So, the HP's customers, all these large corporates investing in technology suddenly stopped. So that project sort of feed sort of stopped. So we had to pivot a bit there. But I also remember we'd spent, 4 or 5 months or so involved with HP in a project, helping them out with the pre-sale side of things, which to us would have been our biggest project we'd ever won. It's probably a 750K services order. And after sort of 3-4 months of sort of working with them, HP qualified out of the opportunity because it wasn't big enough for them. And we're still talking, it was like, I can't remember the numbers. We're talking tens of millions of pounds of whatever to them. And they qualified out. And it's like, my God, this is like a £750,000 services business that we're getting. And it made us just completely opened our eyes to the fact that we're not in control of our sales cycle at that time. Yeah. So which is why we sort of pivoted then to the SMB, because at least then we are in control of it. You're in control of your own destiny. So yeah, that was an interesting period.
Yeah. And I guess you weren't in control of it because you weren't leading the sales process, but equally, you didn't have to go to SMB. You could have kept on selling to larger businesses, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it was quite a conscious decision as well, because I think we felt at the time that, we were winning that business and we were doing a good job, which is why HP kept using us. But in order to be competing in that sort of market, winning the types of orders that HP are ultimately winning and sort of subbing out the services part to us, we'd have been competing with, the SCCs and the computer centers and the likes of. So we just took a very conscious decision that actually, okay, we may win and we've got some credibility through what we've done and some sort of advocates through HP, but we're still going to be competed against those. And it's a little bit like, that old saying, nobody gets sacked for buying IBM, back in the day, was it? Somebody would be taking a real risk on, putting, a couple of £1 million, projects business to what was a 10, 15 person, local, I was going to say MSP, obviously it's the services business, we weren't MSP at the time, run by what was probably a couple of 26-year-olds at the time, ex-engineers. So we just made a very conscious decision that no, we're going to go local and focus on that, what became an MSP business.
Okay, interesting. Okay, very good. So I've diverted you from telling me about the NewCMI sales journey about 3 or 4 times now. So I'm finally going to let you unleash you onto that. So as you say, post integration, you've delegated what you need to delegate internally. You're now sat in the sales and marketing seat. Talk us through how that
looked. Yeah. Well, I guess at the point that so Solsis was the second UK acquisition. Obviously, you're Amacita being and then we were the second. So the point we joined, the business was probably combined was probably about 40 people from memory, and there were a couple of salespeople involved. So CMI had a couple of sales, one in the UK and one over in Northern Ireland. So there was a degree of a sales function there, sort of overseen loosely by the MD. But you can imagine, so Ken was pretty focused on, the wider business and the acquisitions and everything that MD has to focus on. So, so it was a case of sort of, okay, understanding that team, managing that team. Ultimately, one of those salespersons left because, in effect, I took the role that they were, hoping or expecting to get. So they sort of moved on elsewhere. So for a while, it was myself and the chap out in Northern Ireland. And as a board, we had lots of conversations around, okay, what are we going to do to grow this business now? It's, there's the organic stuff, and going out and getting new organic wins. There's acquisitions, do we spend on marketing and the likes there? So we actually chose pretty sort of clearly to really focus on our existing customers. They'd done obviously a couple of acquisitions that started the business back in Northern Ireland, then your business and my business. And we felt there was actually a lot that could be done to, squeeze more juice, as it were, out of the existing customers. But also because the business at that time, they were far from a break-fix business, but they weren't. I remember saying actually at the time, now thinking about it, that CMI was a much mature a business technically, and the sort of capability they had, because it just had more people and more technical, good people there, but probably less mature than Solsis from an MSP perspective, because I think we'd been in it longer, we'd been using the tools longer, and our commercial packaging and our support plans and everything was much better. So I can't remember the split, but if we just use 80-20, probably 80% of the Solsis support business was packaged like MSP plans, and 20% was sort of time bank type stuff, whereas it was flipped the other way from there. So, we spent a bit of time just bringing forward the maturity a little bit of the sort of the commercial packaging. And then from that, we could sort of sell more and, usual white space mapping from that side of things. And we obviously chose to sort of continue with the acquisition route as well. And that's when we acquired BTA in 2019, I think it was. And, that came with, 2 or 3 other salespeople as well. So at this point then we've got quite a sort of, I say, mature sales team. We've got sort of 4 or 5 sellers. And at that point, we decided to really start to invest in marketing, actually trying to get net new as well outside of the acquisition growth. And that's really a lot of effort and focus on trying to get the marketing ball bouncing. I sort of use this analogy. I can't remember where I got this from, but you imagine a sort of a ball, on your desk, and it's just static. And if you're sort of patting it, trying to get it bouncing, it's quite hard work to get the thing bouncing initially. But once it does get bouncing, it gets a little bit easier, but it needs constant focus to keep it bouncing and get it bouncing to the height you want. So, that's what we had to do with the marketing. So we had some stuff we did internally. We sort of appointed an external agency and really just sort of got the external marketing agency, our messaging, our customer profile, ideal customer profile, all aligned, and just got everything sort of working as well as we could do. So I think, from that point in 2016 of sort of selling to CMI, probably in those sort of first 4 or 5 years, it was very much about maturing the business into much more of a mature commercial model of an MSP. And then it was about, integrating the sales function and actually getting the sales function as a team operating really well. And then it was, okay, now we're going to continue with the acquisitions, but we're now going to we need to have our own net organic growth, and actually then working with an external agency and get that ball bouncing and having the patience to know that's going to take, 12 months plus before we really start to see some tangible results out of that.
And within that sales team, did you have focus on new and existing, i.e. dedicated people for each, or was it?
Yes. Only when we sort of made the acquisition in 2019. So we had a team then that, like I say, would have been, I think it was 6 people or so. So prior to that, there was only sort of 2 people in the business. So that was very much, they did everything. They had existing customers to look after, and any leads that came through or referrals, whatever, they followed up on. If you asked, certainly, the chap in NI, his preference would have been the net new, but that's, we've still got the existing customers to look after. When we had the team of 6, there was definitely one person in there who really, I was going to say, doesn't have the patience. That's the wrong thing to say. He gets very bored very quickly. It's a bit like me. You get your kick out of winning the customer and wooing them and doing all that sort of stuff, and then making sure they sort of embed into the business well, and we onboard them properly. And then once they're into that process, so that's sort of 6 months, a year on down, and they're into sort of like business as usual MSP sort of management, that's of no interest, want to go and win the next one, type stuff. So there was definitely that focus. And to the point then we really did structure any future recruitment. We did recruit in to be either a net or a sort of as you want to call it. And actually at CMI, you may recall, we sort of had 2 parts of the commercial facing part of the business. So we had our sellers that were salespeople that wanted to be salespeople, and they were commissioned salespeople. And we had we called them client services at the time, but customer success, that sort of function. So literally the day-to-day account management side of it, but did do selling, but they weren't commissioned. They didn't want to be commissioned. They're not sellers. That's not their motivation. They were there to make sure the customer was really happy, etc. But they transacted their sort of the day-to-day stuff that was going to be sold anyway. Hey, I've got new starters starting next month. I need a couple of new laptops and some licenses, or we're moving office. I need a couple of engineers over a weekend. Can you send us a quote? That stuff doesn't really need selling. And I've said this to my team all along, is that because you can imagine there was some potential for conflict there about where an opportunity sits. To me, it's really clear. It's like, the purpose of a salesperson is to use their sales craft and take responsibility of making the sale, going through the process that is, identifying the need, demonstrating the value, and everything that needs to be as part of the sales process. That's a craft that takes time. And that's what you get paid commission for, doing that successfully. You don't, in my view, you shouldn't be paid for transacting, just order taking in essence. That's how I'm quite a strong believer, where the scale of the business allows it to be this way, because a smaller business, it can't be this way, is to have, you have a sales team or, sales roles that focus on net new organic growth. You have salespeople that are looking after your existing customers, but doing the strategic sort of selling the bigger project type stuff. And then you have a sort of a customer success team, account management team, however you want to call them, that are there more for the, making sure the customer's happy, doing the QBR type stuff, but also transacting the, the order taking type stuff. Because doing that gives time back to the salespeople to go and win the meaty project.
Yeah. And certainly I think we're aligned on having the new and the existing separated to have the focus, because the new stuff, it's in entirely different day-to-day activity than being looking after existing clients, but equally that customer success and then the account management role, I think, can actually be condensed into a single role. Everyone breaks it up slightly differently, and some people have sales admin that do the order, the processing, and a TAM that's more salesy. But absolutely, the new and the existing split is definitely where I've seen it work the best. Trying to do everything in any part of the business is very difficult to prioritize. So,
I mean, it is, the new sort of net new and the sort of the account management piece is, most people, I'm sure there's going to be the odd exception to this that really doesn't care which way that goes, but most people, 95% of people will have a preference to doing one or the other. So when there's enough of one, or they'll neglect the other. And because they can make their sales commission, they can make their targets through the thing they prefer to do. So as a business, that's got a big part of their sales activity being neglected. So, and unfortunately, it's one of those things, you have to go through the pain of it. And we went through the pain of that at Solsis, because we didn't have that structure. Certainly in the sort of early days of Solsis, when we did have salespeople there, and we had the pain. We had very much a structure where, we sort of recruited a salesperson. They might be given a few accounts initially because maybe somebody's left, or we're just sort of splitting out some overload or whatever. But they were to go off and get win this a new account. But when they win a new account, then they'd keep it and then maintain it. But of course, once you built your book of business, then great, you've got some. But you stop winning new business.
Exactly right. Exactly.
So you have to have it split.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay. And we're probably about on time, but let me just, it's always a spirited debate around this topic. How much should you rely on outbound calling, the SDR role? If the BDM is the salesperson, what's been your experience? You mentioned agencies earlier on, but tell me a little bit about what role calling has had and still has in today's mix.
Yeah, when did I start this? So we did recruit an SDR probably 2 years, maybe 3 years before we sold CMI. So we think the structure of the team we had at that time, we had our 6 or 7 sort of salespeople. We had our 6 or 7 sort of customer success team. That was the structure we had, doing that stuff we just talked through. The agency that we were working with they weren't doing telemarketing at the time. So it was very much around the sort of the LinkedIn, the web, the email, all the other sort of market activity. They weren't doing telemarketing, so we did a few events. So, using, we happened to use HubSpot at the time. So, we got that machine working quite nicely with sort of regular activity going out and everything there. But the challenge we were having was that, the new business people I had were the only people that could then sort of follow up on, any webinar sort of registrations, or somebody has downloaded some content, etc., which for a period of time, they were happy doing, but actually that, after sort of 6 months or so, that's distracting them. And frankly, they're a very expensive resource. I don't want them doing that. So we took the decision primarily, at that point in time, the agency we were using didn't do telemarketing, didn't offer telemarketing. And I didn't want to go and have another agency. So I took the decision to actually recruit in an SDR. In some way, it was reasonably experienced. He wasn't sort of a 20-year-old SDR for a sales role type thing. He'd done a few things. He'd actually taken a step back for some sort of personal sort of change in circumstances, that was going on. So, his role was very much around that nurture. So when somebody was, expressing some interest, downloaded some content, it was his role to reach out to them and just sort of nurture and try and move that forward. We started to use Vidyard we used at the time. So videos. And if you remember back in, we're probably going back, 4 or 5 years or so now, the dark web tools that you could have, users for those, we've done Scan and, everything, and using Vidyard. So we're getting quite a lot of traction from that. So that was really, so my experience, come back to your question, it's only really been that one experience other than external telemarketing agencies, which I touched on earlier, which worked great for 6 months and they go off the boil, worked really well. And, actually for him, he was doing that role for a couple of years. And at the point I recruited him, I said, well, we're either you'll have a choice, in 18 months time, either we'll start to build out an and you can sort of lead that, or you might want to take the decision and go the other one, actually, proper sales account management. Which actually is what he opted to do. And also because the agency we're using at that time had since brought in a telemarketing function. So we outsourced that part to them. But yeah, just to come back to, I guess the short answer to the question, I think the SDR role, if you have the sort of capacity to sort of recruit that in or certainly use somebody externally, is critical. Because otherwise you have this big gap between your marketing activity and your internal sales, because your marketing team aren't there to nurture and do all that. They're there to sort of, I guess, create that opportunity for the, really have a call. And it's then our responsibility as sort of the MSP to take that forward from there. However we do that. In some cases, that will be an immediate opportunity that you'll either win or lose. In many cases, it's a case of actually just having to keep in contact, do your stuff, build the relationship, and at some point in the future, that will become a live opportunity for
when the pain builds sufficiently.
Exactly. That zone of tolerance is broken. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, there we are. I was expecting a sort of controversial, spirited debate as we have had in the past, a spirited debate as we called them. But no, we're totally aligned. I mean, who'd have thought it?
I think it's one of those. It's hard, isn't it? And I think it's one of the things I would encourage MSPs now that. I say a tech led. I mean, we say that because most MSPs we know are tech led, but even if you've got more of a commercial sort of leader within that business, the smaller MSPs is trying to sort of start on that journey of growing, if that's what you want to do, and you're going to need to scale out, build a sales team, even if that's just 2 people, 3 people, you can't just go from, the owner, or somebody doing that function, part-time to sort of completely sort of chucking over the fence to somebody else. It needs to be transitioned. So in some cases, whether it's an SDR or you touched on inside sales, where you're actually just sort of passing, sort of delegating some of those sort of more easy to train type activities, less risk activities to sort of start building that. So, inside support, SDR, that's depend on the circumstances that an MSP is in, but that's definitely the first step in that transition, in my opinion.
Yeah. Absolutely. And of course, if you've got one person that can do it all, they're probably going to become an MSP owner themselves rather than be working forever for you. So yeah. As we said at the start, been really great catching up, reconnecting, and I think really good conversations. So hopefully our listeners have gained some value from listening today. It's around this time that we offer our guests a shameless plug. If anyone wants to carry on the conversation,
it's the shameless plug. Okay, I'll take the advantage of that. Yeah, I mean, if it take on the, if you want to carry on the conversation, LinkedIn is the sort of best place to get me. And it's really, for me, I touched on it there. My expertise is in the sales and marketing. That's the how I wore, and I really sort of dug into that area for the last 10 years or so. But the 20 years or so prior to that in Solsis, I've gone through, all the trials and tribulations, the successes and the failures of being an MSP owner, coming from a tech background, trying to build a business. So I've got all the scars on the back, etc. So, I've really taken that experience and then sort of, as a solid foundation and built that through the last 10 years to really refine what I think is a sort of sales leadership, sales management process, ethos, coaching, etc. that I do. And that's really what I'm trying to do now for MSPs, is help them through that. So that if anybody's got any challenges, problems, want to bounce any ideas off, then just reach out to me on LinkedIn. More than happy to just slot some time in. Yeah, my calendar has like half hour, an hour slots, but if we need a couple of hours or whatever, then that's fine. I'm just there to try and help people the opportunity to get to know me a little bit more and move things from there. But I'll work on any form of fractional basis, just trying to help people with evolving or improving or fixing whatever status their sales function is in, and take the experience we've had from running Solsis, which was just to give some sort of scale to this, was a sort of 20-person, £2 million MSP, compared then to CMI, which was a sort of a 17, 18 million, 120-person MSP. And then more recently at BCN that we sold to, which is a sort of 450-person, 75 million MSP. So they're all very experiences, different cultures. So lots of experience there that, I just want to give. That's what I get my kicks from these days.
Very good. I don't think there's many MSPs that have issues with sales, so I'm sure you'll not hear from anyone at all. So your calendar will remain open. I'll go play some more golf then. Graham, it's been great chatting to you today, and hopefully see you around on the event circuit over the coming months.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks for having me.